So, like I said, the next lecture will be online from Mina Cullen, all the way from Auckland in New Zealand. I've no idea what time it is with you, something like 9 o'clock in the evening or 10 o'clock.
No, it's only 8:40, so not doing too poorly.
I thought not not too dramatic then. So she's going to talk about enhancing the accuracy of coarse grain simulation by NMR-driven sampling. We're very happy that you were willing to give this talk, and I'm going to give you the floor. Let's briefly check that your audio comes through properly. Can you just say hello or
Yeah. Hi, is this coming through okay?
yeah, we're cranking up. It's good now. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Please start.
Sweet. Hi, I guess it's good to be here. I don't think I can see any of you on the camera, so I'm essentially just talking to my screen. But yes, I'm just presenting a bit on the major project of my PhD. I'm currently just entering my third year, and I've really been concerned with integrating NMR data into coarse-grained force fields, including but not limited to Martini 3, which gives me a great opportunity to use this very lovely render created for me by a very talented colleague of mine. But I guess without further ado, I'd like to get into it. So I guess there's been a lot of discussion of molecular dynamics already in this conference. But I guess the thing that I would like to touch on or focus on is that since the, I guess, early days of, I guess, the molecular dynamics technique, the systems that have been studied have grown in size from small folded proteins at thousands of atoms up to protein system sizes of tens of thousands, millions, up to hundreds of millions. And so with this growth in the appetite for the size of systems desired to be studied, there's a growth in associated computational demands. And one of the newer techniques that has risen to meet this challenge is that of coarse graining, the process of trying to simplify atomistic models while still retaining critical descriptors of biomolecular systems, with the aim of unlocking the simulation of systems at larger scales, and also over longer time processes. So some of the landmark approaches in this domain would be the Martini force field, which is a widely used force field which focuses on the parameterization of different building blocks representing chemical groups, and has largely been used for the simulation of lipid membranes and membrane-bound proteins, proteins being represented by their backbone atoms, with amino acids differentiated by side chain beads. And the, I guess, critical thing to consider in the case of Martini is that most of the detailed interactions governing protein structure have been lost in the process of coarse graining. And so protein structure is typically handled by restraint potentials, which bias according to an initial starting structure, for example, the elastic network model. Going even further down the track of coarse graining are one bead per amino acid models, which represent amino acids as single bonded beads with specific interresidue interactions parameterized based on the hydrophobicity scale. And these methods have been excellent at capturing the global dimensions of intrinsically disordered proteins, whose vast conformational flexibility they're able to capture in a highly efficient manner. Going further, the simulation technique has also been applied to the simulation of liquid-liquid phase separation in crowded environments. However, these models typically don't natively include any method to simulate secondary structure formation and focus mainly on global dimensions. So while coarse grain has a lot to offer, there is the inherent limitation that it generally does reasonably poorly at parameterizing protein structure. And the most typical approach is to apply restraints based on an initial structure. However, we were interested to know whether NMR data could provide us a way out. And for this, we looked to the chemical shift, so the fundamental observable of NMR, which provides us rich information on protein structure and also is abundantly available. So happily, the Biomagnetic Resonance Bank has over 10 million individual chemical shift entries. And in fact, chemical shift restraints have been previously applied to atomistic simulations, yielding ensembles in great agreement with J couplings, S2 order parameters. So it's been a very fruitful approach. And what we want to know is whether or not chemical shifts can be leveraged in a coarse grain context specifically wanting to target the characteristic understructuring in coarse-grained models. So what does, I guess, our approach consist of? So we're wanting to integrate NMR into a coarse-grained force field on the fly. And this means that at every time step, we need to back calculate chemical shifts for a current coarse-grained conformer, check their discrepancy with an experimentally measured target value, apply a correcting force on top of an underlying force field, and then carry on with our MD algorithm. So in order to do this, I guess the first part of the recipe is the back calculation of chemical shifts from coarse-grained structures. And for this, we are looking to train a predictor of chemical shifts from coarse-grained structures. So we start, I guess, as is typical, with a data set. So just looking at what was in the RCSB, we had around over 3,000 NMR structures that ended up in the training set, a mix of techniques, yielding over 300,000 individual data points. And notably, we've got a range of secondary structure. Around 35% of this data set is either in an alpha helical or extended beta state. And what's important is that when we translate this to coarse-grained degrees of freedom, so moving from an atomistic Ramachandran plot to corresponding coarse-grained angular descriptors, we maintain the strong coalescence of these structured populations. So it's clear to see that secondary structure, for example, can be well distinguished in a coarse-grained context. Having gathered our data, the next goal is to train a neural network for the prediction of chemical shifts from coarse-grained structures, either in the Martini-3 coarse-grained mapping or even in the further reduced C-alpha only coarse-grained mapping. So the first task is to come up with a representation for coarse-grained structures, and for this we simply use their amino acid type and add on some geometric information from their backbone angles and backbone dihedrals and side chain angles. Further, we found that it ended up being very useful to include information from neighboring residues. So we have this tripeptide representation for a given amino acid. And then from there, we simply look to predict the secondary chemical shifts, as these are within similar ranges for each of the 6 backbone atoms, and inform strongly on secondary structure propensity. Just grabbing these from CamCoil predictions. And the thing that we looked to see here was that we actually maintain strong predictive accuracy even in a coarse-grained context. So comparing the coarse-grained predictor to its all-atom predecessor, there was actually very little drop in accuracy, implying that chemical shifts can be predicted with high accuracy even when we lose atomistic degrees of freedom. All right, so this means we can make them, I guess, useful within our simulations. So we now have a differentiable link between coarse-grained coordinates and chemical shifts, meaning that these can now be compared to potential experimental values. This allows us then to set up a coarse-grained restraint potential based on the discrepancy between what we predict during simulations and target experimental values, which can then be differentiated to obtain a correcting force added on top of an underlying force field. A few key points that we look to here is how to mitigate potential over-restraining. And the first of these is, I guess, the functional form of the restraint potential that we apply. Instead of using, I guess, the harmonic potential implied here, we instead employ a flat bottom harmonic potential, where the width of the flat bottom comes from the error of the predictor to prevent over-restraining within the error of the neural network. The second thing we look to is actually the strength of these restraints, where before any simulation, we run short tuning rounds at increasing force constants, try and identify the minimum value that yields us maximal agreement with our experimental data. Another thing we think to consider is the possibility to replicate average our restraints. So it's been discussed many times that what we measure from an NMR experiment might actually, or is quite often, an average measurement, which is composed of multiple states. And so this population average might hide conformational data. So the ideal case is to allow our chemical shift restraints to be satisfied on average by a population of replicates. So what this looks like in practice, I guess with a toy example on this short protein with roughly 30% helical structure, we would set off a series of 4 independent replicate simulations linked by a chemical shift restraint potential, which actually restrains on the average predicted chemical shift across the 4 replicates. Meaning that if we focus on a single chemical shift for a single residue, each of those 4 replicates are able to explore a diversity of chemical shift values. However, their instantaneous average actually agrees very strongly with the experimental value. And the resulting ensemble actually explores multiple different conformational states, again, with a diversity of structured and non-structured conformations. So I guess having defined the restraint potential, what does this tend to look like in practice? So starting again with a toy example, we've taken a stapled mini protein with a range of different secondary structures. Simulating it completely unrestrained, we end up with a high disagreement with experimental data and a high disagreement in terms of structure. So Martini alone actually provides a reasonably disordered ensemble. However, when we switch on this chemical shift restraint potential, we improve both agreements with experiments and with structural metrics and end up with an ensemble respecting much more the natively determined structure. However, we'd maybe chosen a nice example in that we were stapled with disulfide bridges, and our chemical shift restraints really only work for local structure. So the data itself is mostly predictive of local geometry, and furthermore, the predictor we trained is sensitive largely up to 7 residues. So if we were to perform a simulation of ubiquitin at this point, we'd end up with something closer to this. Excellent secondary structure, but really the tertiary packing has been lost here. So what we would, so fortunately we have a way out, and that is actually relying on NOE restraints, which can provide us with natural tertiary distance restraints. And all this really involves is a mapping from atomistic implied distances to coarse grain distances, where we just account for the change in distance induced by the mapping from atomistic to coarse grain. Cool. So now that we have a full set of experimentally derived restraints, we can see how this shapes up with more complex protein structures. So again, starting with another small example, we take this melted initial structure of ubiquitin obtained from simulated annealing and see what we get just applying the native Martini restraints, so the elastic network model. And of course, we fail to return to the native structure of ubiquitin. The elastic network model stays very close to this for initial structure, and Martini with secondary structure restraints alone does no better. However, when we can apply restraints based on experimental chemical shifts in NOEs, we drop at RMSD with respect to the native structure and end up with a much better looking ensemble overall. This meant that we were able to survey a range of proteins with a diversity of folds and apply this further to membrane proteins, which is the target application for Martini. And particularly in the case of Caparas, we were able to find dynamics in the disordered switch regions in high agreement with experimental S2 order parameters. Going further, though, we've also looked to systems which would be prohibitive to simulate in an atomistic context. For example, no, never mind, I've missed this slide. We also wanted to look at the case where missing data is involved. So that would be how much does missing experimental data affect the restraints? And we actually found that we were reasonably robust with respect to missing data. However, it's interesting to point out that since we have a predictor of chemical shifts from coarse grain structure, this predictor could be used to guess synthetic chemical shifts from a structure, which allows us to infill, I guess, missing or unassigned data. And it's also been helpful in determining whether or not an experimental data set was potentially unreferenced by checking for systematic offset. We also found this application useful in the case of the tau amyloid, where we were able to use synthetic chemical shifts to reproduce physiological stacking distances between fibrils. And I would want to point out that the offset between the experimental measurement is actually not so worrying when one considers the bead radius in Martini of 0.256 nanometers, meaning that the synthetic restraints were able to get us as close as possible within a coarse grain context, while still capturing some of the critical interactions keeping the packing of this fibril core, with the notable exception of this glutamic acid, which, however, existed in a protonated state and for which the neural network was not trained and therefore was the only residue here unrestrained. But yes, so now an application to a system of the larger scale, which would be prohibitive to study in an atomistic context, and that is the dissociation of the phospholambin pentamer, a transmembrane protein involved in the regulation of the circa calcium pump. So it exists in an equilibrium between the pentamer and the monomer, with the pentamer thought to act as a reservoir for the inhibitory monomer. However, the research AFA mutation has been shown to eliminate almost entirely the preference for the pentameric state. And what we were interested in was whether or not we could see the shift in this preference, i.e. the shift towards dissociation with the AFA mutant sampled through high throughput NMR-guided simulations. So setting off around 200, 500 nanosecond simulations, we were monitoring the loss of contacts with one of the helices with the rest of the pentameric bundle and found that this happened infrequently for the wild type and much more frequently for the AFA mutant, where that free energy barrier is between the pentameric and dissociated states is essentially lost. So this is, I guess, worked well in the context of structured proteins, but we also have an interest in how this shapes up in terms of disordered proteins. So I've touched on one bead per amino acid models, and Calvados has been a landmark example. It's a model that has shown to yield excellent agreement over radius of gyration for a large set of disordered proteins. However, there isn't a native parameterization for secondary structure, even over this data set of proteins with varying degrees of predicted potential secondary structure. So we were able to apply NMR-based restraints without perturbing the radius of gyration, while managing to sample differing degrees of secondary structure. And in fact, we found that the secondary structure propensities that we sampled yielded better agreement compared to when secondary structure was imposed via the more rigid elastic network. But even further, we were interested in one of the, I guess, most useful applications of these these lowly resolved, coarse-grained, intrinsically disordered protein models, which is the study of biomolecular condensates. So we first noted that the application of restraints does not perturb much the CSAT measured for the concentration of saturation measured for a large set of disordered protein sequences. However, we were interested to see what would happen in the context of some structure-forming proteins, for example, EIF4B, a translation initiation factor, known to form condensates driven by its drug-rich domain. However, the self-association landscape is driven by the wider C-terminal region, which contains this arginine-rich motif with strong predicted helical propensity. Which, when simulated with an unrestrained model, is lost. The elastic network model gives us a very all or nothing approach, while applying secondary structure using experimental NMR data manages to capture better that fractional helicity, especially in the flanking regions. So how this shapes up in the condensate, it's known that this protein does retain this helical segment when undergoing LLPS. And some recent works have identified a correlation between the degree of foldedness in simulated peptide RNA complexes and condensate density. So we performed a set of NMR-guided simulations of this protein and found that the restrained simulations produced a better agreement with experimentally measured concentration of saturation and identified prolonged contacts between that helical motif and the self-association driving drug domain, implying that this helix might be playing a role in modulating the oligomeric preferences of EIF4B. Okay, I guess that was me today. What I wanted really to get across was that it's possible to predict chemical shifts with high accuracy, even when we're sitting in low resolution settings, such as coarse-grained simulations. And that this means that we can now integrate NMR data into coarse-grained MD for the targeting of otherwise inaccessible structural properties. And then finally, that the application can extend further to IDP specialized models. All right. And yeah, thank you very much.